Hello everybody and welcome to the Aggieville Alleycats podcast, where come rain, shine, or anything in between, we're here to deliver to you the Kansas State sporting news that you so love. I'm Ace Edwards and it's just me today because I am currently recording this. It is 1 a.m. on October 13th. This is quite literally the instant reaction, probably the quickest that we have ever done a reaction to just about anything in the K-State sphere. But of course, this is the recap for the 31-28 Wildcat victory up against Colorado in Boulder. The old Big 8 brawl. Rivals, though everyone hated Colorado, so I guess you can't really call it a rivalry. And like I said, this is going to be a little bit more of an instant reaction type of show. Probably get this out, I don't know, I may post this, I suppose, the day that I am recording it. Maybe just give Connor something to listen to. But before we dive more into, game day grades and things like that, I do want to thank the sponsor of today's show, and that is Greg, Arthur, and Grandma. Thank you, Grandma. And if you want to have your name read out at the beginning of every single episode, as well as support the show financially, please be sure to check out the official supporters link to support our show for as little as $1 a month. But let's just go ahead and dive straight into this game, because if you were going by NCAA 14 game score, this would probably be one of those instant classic games where, it really, I'll give credit to Shedeur Sanders for, sort of charging back into this game in the fourth quarter after K-State looked to have it pretty well in hand. And I think the lasting story of this game is just going to be the insane amount of injuries sustained by both sides. I mean, of course, Travis Hunter went out in the first half. Then you had, I believe it was their second leading receiver. His name escapes me right now. He ends up getting hurt. And then K-State basically loses an entire secondary in the second half of this game. And that the injuries are a massive story in this game, and it's probably going to be talked about. Both sides are honestly probably going to have to go through and come up with a myriad of different excuses. But the biggest injury that ended up being a non-story, I suppose, was the injury to Avery Johnson, who ended up leaving at some point in the second quarter, I believe it was. Because, it looked like the Quinn Ewers oblique injury, either that or his kidney decided to explode. I'm not sure. I'm not a doctor. I don't purport to be a doctor, but he ended up leaving the game. And then Taquan Roberson entered the game, and I want to give Taquan Roberson his flowers because, he had a really, really good throw to sort of keep that drive where Avery left alive. And that drive ended up resulting in 7 points. So, massive ups to Taquan Roberson for hitting Jace on that out route. And, there are a lot of things to sort of talk about in this game schematically, and we'll get more into that in a little bit with game day grades. What I do want to talk about is, of course, the Colorado fans being the Colorado fans. There shouldn't be a single soul that is surprised by their behavior of booing injured players. Like I said, that's Colorado fans. That's why no one likes them. And yeah, that's really all I have to say on that. And another person I'm going to give their flowers is Shedeur Sanders, who, had an amazing night, 34-40, 3 touchdowns, though the one interception he had was really, it was comically bad. It was like a karma interception from the good Lord himself. But, yeah, I don't want to say that Colorado played poorly because they didn't. They played well enough to win this game. It's just that K-State ended up playing better off of a massive throw to Jace Brown from Avery Johnson on a drive where I noticed that there was a lot of panicking, and I don't blame people who did, but there was about 3 minutes left on the clock, 2 timeouts. They could have drove down the field. Honestly, my biggest concern at the time was them scoring too quickly, but that ended up not being a concern because Shedeur Sanders couldn't do anything on the last drive. But yeah, other than that, Avery Johnson making that amazing throw to Jace Brown. The other really big performance, comes from DJ Giddens making Shiloh Sanders his son. You may have to Deion Sanders might be putting up adoption paperwork for Shiloh Sanders within the next 12 hours because DJ Giddens is legally this man's father now. The amount of times that he made him look like a complete idiot on the field, despite the fact that Shiloh was clearly headhunting him. Like that's like a 30 for 30 documentary happening right before our eyes between the man who doesn't talk and the little brother, or the older brother, who acts like the little brother and will always be forgotten, except for when people mention DJ Giddens. So shout out Shiloh Sanders, you have now been sunned by some guy from Junction City, Kansas. But now we can dive a little bit into game day grades, where we go through every single position group, including coordinators, giving them a grade from A+, meaning they near single-handedly won us the game, to an F, which means they near single-handedly lost us the game. There are no Fs this week. There are a few there are a few things that made it a little bit of a contender, but I do want to start. We always start with the man under center, and that is Avery Johnson, and I suppose a little bit of Taquan Roberson. And I ended up giving the quarterback room a B+. And the reason why they didn't sort of elevate themselves into an A is Avery Johnson is still very much a young quarterback. On that last drive, where he threw the play before he threw the interception and Will Swanson wide open because he just wasn't being kept by a defender. And it would be one thing if I knew he couldn't do it, but he literally did that like 3 plays before. Again, maybe Wunkus wants to hop on this episode. She's probably wondering why I'm suddenly so calm. But yeah, Avery, he had some amazing plays. Like that throw to Jace at the back end of the game to sort of seal for the go-ahead touchdown. That was an amazing throw, and that's honestly probably like a top 5 throw in the history of us doing the show. It's probably number 1 is the mailbox throw up against Baylor by Will Howard to Ben Sinnott, which, by the way, shout out Will Howard for a generational what are you doing moment. Skyler in the Texas Bowl to Phillip Brooks on the slot fades also up there, but I'm getting off track. Avery Johnson had himself a very, very good game. The only thing that I want to see more from him, and it's been the sort of bugaboo the entire time this year. I want to see him sort of respond better in the face of pressure. Because, yeah, he was under pretty consistent pressure. 4 total sacks for Colorado this game. But a few of those, honestly, could have been avoided with a better or quicker decision. And once Colorado figured out the blitz zero strategy that I've always been a massive proponent of, Avery that's why the interception happened. Avery got caught in a blitz zero where they ended up bluffing and dropping a guy out into the slant window, ends up batting the ball for an interception. And, that happens to NFL quarterbacks. You can just look at the Miami Dolphins, Baltimore Ravens game a few years ago where Brian Flores put Lamar Jackson into a blender. But I was generally impressed with Avery this game. He goes 224 through the air, 15 of 23, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception. It's just the yards that he left on the field sort of kept him from getting an A from me. And like I said earlier, I do want to give Taquan Roberson his flowers. 2 of 3, 14 yards, and honestly, those could have been like some of the most impactful 14 yards of the game, especially on how big of a momentum drive that was, and how easy it would have been for the wheels to sort of fall off in that moment. And I think that's a big part of, like, a big takeaway from this entire game was this was a game that very, very easily could have had the wheels fall off at several points. But K-State was able to sort of compose themselves and keep the ball rolling, basically. And I think that's a massive step up from the last road game that K-State had up against BYU. And I also forgot to mention that K-State, that Avery Johnson, rather, did get a rushing touchdown despite finishing with negative rushing yards. But, yeah, I ended up giving the quarterback a B+. Now, for the running back, this was probably the easiest A+ that I've ever given to a running back room outside of the UCF game last year. I mean, DJ Giddens goes 25 for 182 and ends up picking up when catching one of the most consequential passes in the game on that last drive, going 2 for 38 through the air. The only knock on him was he had a really, really bad drop. But again, everything else sort of cancels out. And if it was just DJ alone, that would be an A-plus performance. But Dylan Edwards ends up going 7 for 21 with a touchdown himself, and that was really big too. Also ends up getting 3 catches for 27 yards. Also had a drop on that last drive. And I will talk a lot about that, or that second to last drive, I should say. I will talk about that drive whenever we get to Connor Riley, because I have a few thoughts on that. I'm sure everyone does, because, the offensive coordinator is never a loved individual. But, yeah, this was an exceptionally easy A-plus for the running back room, just because, we have a highlight that we're going to probably put onto every highlight reel where DJ Giddens made Shiloh Sanders especially religious for a couple of seconds. But, yeah, easy A-plus for the running backs. I really don't have much in the way of, heavy-hitting, hard-hitting analysis there. They just had an awesome game, DJ Giddens and Dylan Edwards. Now, the wide receivers were another interesting case, and if you asked me, I would probably tell you that the wide receivers have been the most difficult room to grade on the entire year. Because, you have the standout in Jace Brown going 6 for 121, 2 touchdowns. He caught the only 2 passing touchdowns from K-State. And then Dante Cephas showed up, 2 catches for 16, and then Jaden Jackson 1 for 14. So you only have 3 receivers showing up on the stat sheet. However, Jace Brown, again, caught that amazing pass on that go-ahead drive. And, the receivers are pretty consistently getting open, which is something that I'm not sure I could have entirely expected, because I kind of expected this to be, I very much expected it to be a running type game, and it was. But I didn't expect the receivers to be getting open as consistently as they were. Now, some of that is Travis Hunter getting hurt. Now, I'll fully acknowledge that. But yeah, Ty Bowman got open on a crossing route where Jace Brown actually got the catch from Taquan Roberson. And it was just small stuff like that, like getting guys open on crossers and just not hitting them. But I've said a lot, and I haven't given the grade yet. I ended up giving them a B+, mostly off of the back of Jace Brown. And again, it sort of falls to Jace Brown being this sort of massive impact player that showed up in the exact moment that you needed him. He was the security blanket to end all security blankets this game. And I believe he might have been the only receiver after the third quarter to record a catch, because both of Cephas's catches were in the first quarter, and I believe Jaden Jackson's was in the second. But someone can correct me on that if indeed I have spread a falsehood. But I gave them a B+, because they were getting consistently open. They were run blocking very well, again, as evidenced by DJ Giddens' existence. And they were there, specifically Jace Brown was there in the biggest moments of the game where we needed him most. So a B+ for the wide receivers. That's actually, I ended up giving a similar grade to the tight ends, fullbacks, who had probably the biggest heater of a game from a tight ends and fullbacks room, just in terms of run blocking, because on the amount of, for a couple of times that they were running, they being K-State, ran duo or zone split or some GH counter actions, they were working pretty well off of the back of the tight ends blocking. A lot of those concepts, except for duo, have a lot of the tight end going across the formation to sort of be that kick-out block. And a lot of times, that's the most critical block on a lot of those plays. And the tight ends were consistently doing that. And, they only had 3 catches, the room entirely, 3 catches for 22 yards. Garrett Oakley, 2 for 17. Will Swanson, 1 for 5. You could argue that, Avery missed Will Swanson twice in really, really critical and sweaty situations. And that was another one where you're like, yeah, that's a young quarterback doing young quarterback things. But I ended up giving the tight ends a B plus because this is genuinely the most impactful that a tight end fullback room has been in the running game in my memory of running the show. And again, maybe I was just paying special attention to them because of the amount of GH action, which is guard H-back for, I don't know. Sometimes I just rattle off terms and expect everyone to know what I'm talking about. It's pulling guard and H-back across the formation to sort of have kick-out blocks or lead blocks on a run opposite side of shotgun. But, yeah, I walked away massively impressed with the blocking of the tight ends. And they were, again, there and getting open in the passing game good enough to get a B+. Now, the offensive line was another difficult grade because if it was purely pass blocking, yikes, because this was a shockingly bad game for a unit that's been pretty good pass blocking this year. And they figured it out a little bit more in the second half, but that first half, Avery was under constant pressure in a way that I don't really think that he's been throughout the majority of this season. You could kind of tell that, Avery's still learning. He's a young quarterback, so of course, pressure is going to affect him differently than it affects like a 25-year-old man who just so happens to be playing college football, but he's bad at it too. I'm talking about Alan Bowman. But, yeah, the offensive line's pass blocking was not very good, and a part of that could have been Colorado pretty quickly figured out that K-State was pretty stubbornly going to stick with their man-to-man pass protection, with the occasional block being forced from DJ Giddens, who actually, that's another, I suppose, knock on his game, was he did whiff on a block that would have sealed up Avery to be free of pressure, but that's not going to affect the grade. But despite all of that, and that being a lot of negatives, they did sort of figure it out in the second half, or at least they got a lot better. But the one thing that they were consistently good at was the run blocking. And if you were to average it out, I'd say it was like a C- pass blocking game and like an A+ run blocking game. We just ran the ball a lot better. So I ended up settling on, say it with me now, a B+ for the offensive line. There's a lot of B+ on the offensive side of the ball because I feel like the offense sort of gelled together in a way that we certainly didn't see up against BYU, and we haven't seen very often outside of Manhattan whenever they've been playing their games in Bill Snyder Family Stadium. But I walked away feeling pretty good about a lot of the individual offensive pieces in this game, and there have been times this year where there's been one room where I'm like, yeah, that's a little iffy, but not this game. It's just that not a lot of them had sort of the generational performances or the really, really near flawless performances that a lot of A grades end up getting, other than the running backs room, of course. But maybe that's sort of related to the offensive coordinator, which is the next grade coming up for Connor Riley. And I mention this every time, and I'm going to keep mentioning it until it stops being relevant. I was one of the biggest skeptics of the Connor Riley hire, and I do want to talk about that last drive first, or the second to last drive. I keep calling it the last drive, like the game is over after that. Someone else made that mistake, not me. But that second to last drive, I believe the first 3 plays were perfect. Like that slant route to Jace Brown. In theory, that little hitch route to Dylan Edwards, if he doesn't bobble it, that's another perfect call. So you got 3 borderline perfect calls to open that second to last drive. And then Colorado starts showing the blitz zero look. And all of a sudden, Connor Riley just decides that maybe play calling is stupid. and he comes up with two really kind of not great play calls that just so happen to work out. And one play call that is, you can't, if they're going to give you the same look, they're not going to give you the exact same look 3 times in a row. You have to know that when they're giving you that blitz zero look, eventually they're going to drop out into the backside of the slant window, because you'd already burnt them on that on a little hitch route to Garrett Oakley. So that was one of the, that was sort of the biggest takeaway that you could point at and go, okay, that was Connor Riley sort of figuring it out. And other than that, I do think that Connor Riley had a pretty decent game. I'm not going to say that he had like this absolute heater, this banger of a game where he came out with this perfect game plan, because, you know, in that third quarter, that first drive, awesome. Second drive, terrible. And then the fourth quarter happened, and it just so happens that you have an Avery Johnson and a Jace Brown on your team, and that sort of bails out the play calling on that last drive. But then again, you look at a lot of the first half, and you're like, okay, this is a really, really efficient offense. Connor Riley is scheming up a beautiful running game, and it's consistently working against this team. And it was sort of the game plan that I sort of formulated going into this game that I mentioned on the preview. You want to make this game gross. You want to make this game as disgusting as possible, and a lot of that comes down to running the ball. And they were running the ball amazingly in that first half. I think one of the touchdown drives we had, we didn't throw the ball that entire drive. It was legitimately just, you know, here's a GH counter or GH power play. Here's inside zone. Here's duo. And then each of those plays gain like 12 to 15 yards. And so you're just like, you know what? Maybe that works. Maybe that's the plan. And all credit in the world to Connor Riley for sticking with that plan. And I don't necessarily agree with the general consensus of, you know, he got too conservative in the fourth quarter. I think that running the ball in that situation is sort of the right move towards the back end. And if anything, I was sort of going in the opposite direction, where it was on that second to last drive. I was like, why are you not running the ball? Even a little bit on that last drive. You had the 3 minutes. Why weren't you running the ball, especially when you had the 2 timeouts? It ends up not mattering. But yeah, it's a mixture of it's a strange mixture of some of the most encouraging Connor Riley moments of the year, followed very, very closely by some of the worst Connor Riley moments of the year. So I ended up giving Connor Riley a C+ for this game. And in some ways, the thing is, this is the grade that I've sort of wrestled with the most. Like, even while I've been talking and doing this episode, I've been bouncing back and forth between anywhere from like a C- to a B for Connor Riley, because the things that he did well, he did really, really well. Like the run game scheming, which we all knew that Connor Riley was going to be good at that. But it's just that a few drives where this game could have easily been over had Connor Riley just made a few key adjustments to focusing more on short passing game, more, you know, intermediate routes against the man coverage. And it's just a bunch of really good mixed with a lot of really bad. And to me, that sort of balances out to a C+. But moving to the defensive side of the ball, you have, starting with the defensive line, who, by the way, Ryan Davis did end up getting a sack, so Ryan Davis mentioned, raw. But K-State ends up getting 6 sacks on the game, 2 from Brendan Mott, 1 from Cody Stufflebean, 1 from Ryan Davis, and 1 from Travis Bates. There is one that's missing, but that's a linebacker, so we'll talk about that in its own time. So 5 sacks for the defensive line. And Brendan Mott having himself a game is like quietly getting himself into like he's quietly getting himself some like maybe late round draft pick hype, which if you would have told me that at the beginning of the year, I could see an outside shot where that ends up happening. But Yeah, the pass rush was ferocious for K-State, and a big part of the amazing performance from the defensive line is holding Colorado to negative 29 rushing yards, which is one of the most hilarious stats that I have ever seen in doing this show. Negative 29 rushing yards is comedy encapsulated. Beautiful work by the defensive line. The only complaint is sometimes the rush lanes weren't being kept properly, so you gave Shedeur Sanders an opportunity to escape. Whatever, you got too good at your job, so you gave the guy an out. Oh well, it's an A+ for the defensive line for getting that consistent pressure and making sure that the run game was completely non-existent for Colorado. And you made them one-dimensional. It almost didn't matter, but we'll talk about that. But defensive line, again, another absolute heater from them. And it's a pretty similar story with the linebackers this game. Desmond Purnell ends up registering a sack. Austin Romaine ends up getting 5 tackles, including a really, really impressive one on Shedeur Sanders while he's rolling out of the pocket that could have... If Austin Romaine wasn't the one that was there, that probably is pretty pretty devastating for K-State. And I think the linebackers did really, really well. Again, especially in the running game, because that's mostly their job in a 3-3. And the only thing that kept them from getting an A+ was a lot of the middle field stuff was pretty consistently getting open. And I know that that's how Colorado's offense is schemed, where they are going to scheme up the middle of the field to abuse linebackers. That's the entire point of the bounce concept, which they ran like 12 times this game. The majority of Colorado's success came in the over-the-middle passing game, which, again, is their thing, and it's amazing that they're able to do that without a running game. But they still had an outside passing presence. Again, we'll talk about it in probably about 45 seconds, but this was a really solid performance by the linebackers. I ended up giving them an A. Only thing kept them from an A+ was I felt that they were taking the cheese just a little bit too often. But now we get into the biggie. Now you say, wow, Colorado scored 28. How have 2 of the groups gotten A's? Well, let me tell you, the defensive back room was completely outmatched. And I want to be nice. I really want to be nice because they were dealing with a lot of injuries. I think Keenan Garber, Jacob Parrish, Justice James, Marquise Siegel, I think there was one more in the defensive backfield that ended up going down and got booed by the Colorado fan base because, the Battery people are really, really... the Battery people of Boulder are really, really classy individuals, including the guy who starting a fight and then fell down the bleachers. I wonder how he's doing. But the defensive backs, in a way that maybe they haven't been the entire year and probably won't be for the rest of the year, they were just kind of getting outmatched by Colorado. And that was the entirety of the outside passing game, was defensive back gets beat by someone very, very, very talented. And sometimes you can't really fault guys for that. But the defensive backs had a very, very rough day, not only in terms of injury, but in terms of play as well. The only guy that I would say probably had a decent day would be VJ Payne, picking up an interception and being pretty good in run defense. But yeah, this was the one that if K-State were to lose this game, they would have gotten the F in this game. But because we won and because VJ got the interception, they're gonna walk away with a D+, which... The good news is that this is by far the most talent that the K-State secondary will see the entire year. And yeah, they almost gave up 400 yards of passing, but they also ended up winning the game. So, I suppose take the good with the bad, but I would rather the bad didn't exist at all, quite frankly. And tangentially related to the quandary of the defensive backs is the grade of Joe Klanderman. Now, there are a lot of times that when I see it or a room just straight up getting beat, I'm like, well, there's not really much that you could do if you're the coordinator here. Your guys are just losing. Like there's nothing you can do as a coordinator about that. But there got to a point where it seemed like every decision that Joe Klanderman was making was wrong. And I don't mean that in the traditional sense that, he's just guessing wrong. To where, no, I mean quite literally that it was very obvious that Colorado had picked up on something, most notably the K-State zone coverage, which whenever you have an offense that is almost entirely predicated off of beating zone coverage and you choose to run mostly zone coverage, that's not exactly the biggest formula for success. And I tweeted about it. I tweeted about it. Hand to God, I was only serious about it once. But I kept saying, like, hey, you should run cover zero here to get more pressure because, that's really the only answer at this point. Whenever your defensive backs are having trouble, in coverage, one of the best things that you can do is turn up the pressure on the quarterback because at least then you can kind of say you tried. If they're going to get beat regardless of whether or not there's a blitz coming, you may as well send the blitz because it's easier to scheme up pressure than it is to scheme up coverage. But it was a very frustrating game from Joe Klanderman. Some of it is on him. Others, I'm sort of willing to give him a mulligan. So I ended up just giving him a C, which in some ways might seem generous, giving up 28 to an offense that quite literally was just an air raid team. But, it's a supremely talented air raid team and almost certainly the most, piece by piece, the most collectively talented team that K-State will face on the entire year. And that sort of leads us into offensive and defensive MVPs. This is easy for both sides. DJ Giddens wins offensive MVP, though Jace Brown was very, very close. Well, not very close. Not very, very close, but very close to getting the offensive MVP honors here. But I can't ignore a 200 yards from scrimmage game by DJ Giddens. You just can't ignore that, even though he didn't score a touchdown, which that'll be a trivia question in the future, I'm sure. And DJ Giddens gets offensive MVP. Defensive MVP, you could have Austin Romaine. You could make an argument for Des Purnell, despite the roughing the passer penalty, which, yes, that was a penalty. You can't do that to a quarterback. Can't lean your body weight on him like a second and a half after the ball's been thrown. But I think I'm going to end up giving the pick here to Brendan Mott. Not only because he got the 2 sacks, but because even outside of those 2 sacks, he was bringing consistent pressure. And again, that was sort of the difference in this game was whether or not K-State was able to get pressure. Because if the answer was yes, Colorado did nothing. But if the answer was no, or Shedeur Sanders was able to evade it, it was a big play. So in a lot of ways, there's really only the 2 picks, at least to my mind, between Brendan Mott and Austin Romaine. I'm going to give the nod to Brendan Mott. And now to get into more general takeaways. It's amazing how much shorter these episodes are whenever there's just one person talking. But that's not shade at Connor. That's just an observation. But the biggest takeaway from this game is this is a game where K-State simultaneously snatched defeat from the jaws of victory and then said, oops, takesies, backsies, and then grabbed victory from the jaws of defeat, all within the span of like 5 minutes. And that's something that, you obviously never want the first part to happen, but it's the teams that can recover from getting punched down like that and sort of get back up, that those are the teams that end up clutching up and doing the best at doing the best. In Colorado, they did it themselves, but K-State ends up being the better team here. And a big part of that was there's been a lot of talk pretty much throughout the entire Kleiman era about what people call the middle eight, which is the last 4 minutes of the second quarter and the first 4 minutes of the third quarter. There is no world where you can argue that K-State did not win the middle eight of this game, and that's a massive piece of improvement in the K-State sphere. And it's been a consistent issue for K-State, and it wasn't in this one. We seem to just kind of move those struggles to the fourth quarter, which made the game a lot more stressful, but that is progress that K-State had going forth. And this is a team that's getting better game by game. And I know that's really cheesy coach speak answers like, oh, you have to go 1-0 every single day. But this is a team that you can see the markers of improvement every single game. You put the BYU, K-State, you put the team that played up against BYU, they lose this game. You probably put the K-State team that played up against Arizona, and they probably lose this game, considering how home field and everything goes. But K-State didn't blink, at least the offense didn't blink in the biggest moments, and they were able to clutch up and walk away with a victory. And that is a massive moment and showing of growth from this team, where it would have been much, much easier to sort of wither up and die. And they ended up thriving in the offense. Again, I need to clarify. The offense ended up thriving in that exact moment where they needed to most. And that's just a hats off to Jace Brown and Avery Johnson for that big-time throw. And the other takeaway, this is more of a joking takeaway, but Colorado fans are still the exact same that they've always been in the Big 8 days. And I've heard stories from the Big 8 days of slashed tires, beer bottles, and batteries. So, yeah, it really is amazing how one place can remain the same all of those years. I'm just saying that whenever the rapture happens, no one in Boulder, Colorado will know the difference. But so now just sort of peeling back the layers here and looking just a little bit at the Big 12 standings here. Let me pull them up and definitely not stall for time whilst I am doing so, because there are a few pretty important games that happened this week. K-State now finds themselves 2-1 in conference play. The top of the conference remains BYU, Iowa State, and Texas Tech. Iowa State ends up beating West Virginia in Morgantown. BYU ended up beating up on Arizona despite an initially solid showing from Arizona at the beginning of the game. And Texas Tech was on bye this week. So K-State, again, has sort of found themselves, quite literally in this case, in that second tier of teams in Big 12 contention. I will maintain it until my dying breath. I don't know what BYU is doing, but they seem to have stolen the religious-based institution magic that TCU had in 2022, where a bunch of things just happened to keep going their way. The bad thing is that I think this BYU team is significantly worse than that TCU team that ended up losing to K-State in the Big 12 championship. I'm sort of just waiting for the fall of BYU because I don't think they're a good team. I've gone on record and I will continue to say it. So if we end up playing them in the Big 12 championship, we are losing that game because of how jinxes for me apparently work. Iowa State has looked pretty solid, surprisingly so. I thought they were going to be really bad this year. That's not a jinx. That's me saying my previous thoughts. They're good this year. But Texas Tech is sort of the odd man out of that Tier 1. But the other part of looking at this is that it at one point looked like K-State got a really favorable draw, and in some ways they did. They do end up drawing West Virginia and KU and Houston, which West Virginia in Morgantown will always be scary. KU, God love them, they're trying. And then Houston laid the smackdown on TCU, so they may... It's entirely possible that there's a Big 12 circle of suck, which would make sense considering how he took a lot of the Pac-12 schools. But Arizona State, Cincinnati, and Iowa State are all suddenly looking like, oh, wait a minute, they could be good. So I don't think I can overstate how important winning this game in Colorado was to sort of not only give you that shot of confidence of like, okay, yeah, we can win on the road, which is massively important in this Big 12, but it sort of gives you that, I don't want to say wiggle room, because I don't believe that there will be a Big 12 team that finishes undefeated in conference play, but it sort of gives you that, step up that a lot of teams may not have gotten up against this Colorado squad. So, in short, very, very happy with the victory, even though it got probably unnecessarily stressful at times. But, walking away from Boulder with a victory, especially coming off of a bye week whenever Colorado started storming back in that second half, since they apparently have a propensity for miracles, which is hilarious because Boulder is apparently a godless place. But walking away victorious, in some ways escaping, but picking up the dub is always going to be appreciated. There might be, maybe this upcoming week during the weekly recap, Connor can give his brief thoughts, but thank you all for making it to this point, just me. Next week will be the matchup up against West Virginia in Morgantown, but until then, thank you all for listening to this episode of the Aggieville Alleycats podcast. If you want to follow or contact the show, you can follow us just about anywhere at Aggieville Alleycats. And if you want to email us, we're AggievilleAlleycats@gmail.com. If you want to follow me on a more personal note, I'm at ACEdward00. If you want to follow my co-host, he is at Connor Baldazora, capital C, capital B. And if you want to support the show financially, please be sure to check out both the official Aggieville Alleycats merch store and the supporters link, both found in our podcast and Twitter bios. But most importantly, thank you all for listening to this episode of the Aggieville Alleycats podcast. Where come rain, shine, or anything between, we're here to deliver to you the Kansas State sporting news that you so love. Stay safe, Alleycats.